The wind is howling across a Montana trail, and a man named Silas Brennan is doing what he's done for years. Ride in, work, leave, never get close. His whole life fits in a saddlebag, except for one thing he can't throw away, an old deputy's badge that still weighs like a ghost. Then he hears it, one sound that cuts through the storm, a child crying. He tells himself to keep moving, but his hands stop the horse anyway. And when he crests the ridge, what he sees will change everything. An 8-year-old girl barefoot in the snow, bleeding, shaking, and whispering 2 words that can break even the hardest man alive. Please, help. Who is she? What happened behind those closed doors in town? And why does this broken drifter suddenly feel like the choice he makes in the next minute will decide whether he stays a nobody or becomes the man he was meant to be? Lesson. Sometimes the smallest act of courage, stopping when everyone else rides on, can save a life and heal your own. If you want the full story, hit like, drop a comment with what you'd do in Silas's place, share this with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. That December wind didn't faze Silas. He was used to the cold, used to being alone, with his heart locked down tight. He just kept his horse, Copper, moving toward the next town, which was just like the last one. All towns were the same now. Places to work, eat, and leave before folks got too friendly. His saddlebags carried his whole life. $37, a spare shirt, some bullets, and a deputy's badge he just couldn't throw away. That badge belonged to a man who died back in a Kansas farmhouse, holding his wife's hand as she passed away giving birth. Their little boy followed her into the next life just 6 hours later. Silas shook the memory away. Just keep moving, he told his horse. Then he heard it, a sound that sliced right through the wind. It was the cry of a child, and it sounded desperate. Every bone in his body told him to keep riding. A child meant trouble, and trouble was something he had sworn off for good. He nudged Copper to move faster, but the crying got louder, weaker, like someone who had been yelling for hours. Not my problem, Silas growled, but his hands betrayed him. He pulled on the reins, stopping Copper in his tracks. The sound was coming from over a snowy ridge. Damn it all, he cursed, swinging down from the saddle. His boots sank deep into the snow. He tied Copper to a branch and walked toward the sound, his hand resting on his pistol. Hello? He called out. The crying stopped cold. When he rounded the ridge, he saw her, a little girl, no older than 8, huddled in a thin, patched dress. But it was her feet that made his blood run cold. They were bare, barefoot in a Montana snowstorm. They were a terrible blue-white color with blood staining the snow where she'd been running. She looked up, and her big brown eyes were filled with a hope that hit him like a fist. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. You have to help. Silas felt his throat tighten. Help with what? Where are your folks? She stumbled toward him, grabbing his coat with a surprising grip. My mama, she said, choking on the words. She's real sick, burning up with fever. The Thorntons slammed the door on me. Mr. Morrison at the store said we weren't his problem. The words poured out of her in a rush. I went all the way to the Hendricks farm, but she told me to go away before I made her family sick. I've been walking since morning, mister. My feet hurt so bad, but I can't stop. Mama will die if I stop. Her legs gave out right then. Silas caught her just before she hit the snow. She felt like nothing in his arms, just a bundle of bones and desperation. Easy now, he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. I've got you. She looked up at him. You won't leave? You won't ride away like the others? He looked down at her tear-streaked face and felt a wall inside him start to crumble. What's your name? He asked. Grace. Grace Weston. All right, Grace. Where is your mama? Relief washed over her face. Our cabin. About 3 miles that way, she pointed. Can you take me? I don't think I can walk anymore. Without a second thought, Silas scooped her up and carried her back to Copper. He grabbed a spare blanket from his saddlebag and wrapped it tight around her small, shivering body. Then he lifted her onto the saddle and swung up behind her. "We'll get you warm, then we'll go get your mama." "She's been sick for 3 days," Grace said, her voice muffled by the wool. "First she was just tired, then the shaking started. Yesterday she stopped knowing who I was. She kept calling for my papa, but he's been gone since March." Her small body pressed against his chest. "What's your name, mister?" "Silas. Silas Brennan." She paused for a moment. "Are you a good man, Mr. Brennan?" That question hit him harder than a punch to the gut. A good man? He used to be. A deputy sheriff in Kansas, a husband, almost a father. A man who believed in right and wrong. Now he was just a drifter who had almost left a little girl to freeze to death. "I'm trying to be," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Grace seemed to think that over. "I reckon that'll have to do." Silas gently nudged Copper forward, heading west into the storm, toward a dying woman and a whole world of trouble he had just agreed to take on. As they rode, he asked, "How long has it just been you and your ma?" "Since Papa died last March," she said. Her voice was flat, the way kids sound when they talk about something too big to understand. "He was breaking a horse for Mr. Thornton. It threw him against a fence post. Snapped his neck." Silas clenched his jaw. A woman and child, all alone for almost a year. "What about the Thorntons? Your papa died working for them." "Mr. Thornton paid for the bury-in," she said. "He told Mama that made them square. Mrs. Thornton brought us food for a little while, but then she just stopped coming." The casual cruelty of it was a familiar feeling to Silas. People are full of pity when it doesn't cost them anything. "What about the store?" Silas asked. "The one Mr. Morrison runs?" Grace shook her head against his chest. "Mama owes him $23 from last winter. He said he ain't running a charity, and he won't give us nothing else till we pay." "And there's a doctor?" "Dr. Holloway. We owe him $40 from when Papa got hurt and Mama twisted her ankle. He won't come out again unless we can pay him first." Silas did the math in his head. The woman was trapped, owing money to the whole town. She was working herself into an early grave just trying to keep her and her little girl alive. No wonder she was sick. "That little girl, Grace, she told me her mama was something else. Said she could work harder than any 2 men and had a gift for healing with herbs, something her own daddy taught her. But she knew something was dead wrong. Mama never stays in bed," she said. "Not ever. For 3 days, a bad fever had been taking hold. First, it was just the shakes. Then she started seeing folks who weren't there. That morning, she couldn't even recognize her own daughter. Silas knew what that meant. A high fever for 3 days with no proper care. That was a bad sign. A real bad one. "It is just over that hill, sir." When they finally reached the top, Silas's gut tightened. The cabin down below looked like it was trying to sink into the earth, with a sagging roof and gaps between the logs you could see right through. But the worst part was the chimney. No smoke. No smoke meant no fire. And in this cold, that meant deep, deep trouble. He pushed his horse on. Grace whispered, "That is home," and he could hear the pain in her voice. At the door, he tried to get her to wait. "No," she said, grabbing his arm with all her might. "I am not leaving her again." He didn't argue. The second he pushed the door open, the smell of sickness and cold, stale air hit him like a fist. It was freezing inside. On a small bed, a woman lay still as death, her face flushed with fever. She was younger than he expected, maybe 34 or 35. Grace ran right to her side. "Mama, I am back. I brought help." The woman's eyes fluttered open. "Grace, baby, I told you to stay." "I had to, Mama." Her gaze drifted past her daughter to the tall stranger in the doorway. "Who?" Silas stepped forward. "My name is Silas Brennan, ma'am. Your daughter is a very stubborn little girl." A small smile touched her chapped lips. "That is my girl." Silas spoke softly. "Mrs. Weston, I need to check your fever." He saw the pride in her eyes, the kind that hates asking for anything. "I cannot pay you," she whispered. "We do not have nothing." Silas kept his voice low and calm. "Ain't nobody asking for payment. We are just here to help you." He laid the back of his hand on her forehead. The heat was dangerous, the kind that could cook a person's good sense right out of them. "Grace," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, "I need you to listen to me. First, get a fire going in that hearth. Now." "I have been doing it since I was 6, Grace said, already moving. Silas turned back to Clara, who was watching him with those fever-bright eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she breathed. "You do not know us." He found a rag and dipped it in a pitcher of old water. "Your little girl walked for miles through the snow, barefoot, because every last one of your neighbors turned her away. But she did not stop." He met her gaze. "A child with that much spirit does not come from nowhere, ma'am. That means her mama raised her right, and that is worth something." Tears ran down Clara's cheeks. "Her feet, are they frostbitten?" "They will hurt some, but she will be all right," Silas assured her. "I will see to them once we get you stable." Clara's hand, burning hot, found his. "Promise me," she begged. "If I do not make it, you will take Grace to Dr. Holloway. He will find her a place. Promise me." Silas thought about a promise he made to his own dying wife, one that had haunted him for 4 long years. He shook his head. "I'm not going to make you that promise, ma'am, because I'm not planning on letting you die. Your only job right now is to breathe and to fight." Clara stared at him. "You are either the bravest man I've ever met or the biggest fool." "Probably both, ma'am," Silas admitted as the new fire began to warm the room. "The fire is going good, Mr. Brennan," Grace called out. "All right. Now you put your boots and a coat on before you even think about fetching that water. You understand?" He turned back to Clara. Her dress was soaked through. "Mrs. Weston, we need to get you into some dry clothes." "Blue nightgown," she whispered. "Top shelf." He hesitated, feeling the awkwardness of it all. She seemed to read his thoughts. "Ain't got the energy to be modest, mister. You just do what needs doing." So he did, working as fast as he could. Still, she got the job done. By the time Grace returned, her mama was in dry clothes and Silas was dipping fresh rags in the water. "Good work, little one," he said as she set down the heavy bucket. "I'm going to need at least 2 more. You up for that?" "I can manage," she said, and was gone again. Silas just shook his head, amazed at the 8-year-old girl. Her feet were still aching from the frostbite, yet she moved with the grit of a grown woman. "She's really something, isn't she?" Clara whispered, her eyes on the door. "Ever since her daddy Samuel died. She's had to be. Grew up way too fast." Silas didn't know why he asked, but he did. "Tell me about your husband." Something in the way she said his name, a mix of love and sorrow, made him want to know. "Samuel was the kindest man, so patient. When we met, I was just a girl from Boston who knew nothing about a hard life. He taught me everything," Clara said, her voice dreamy from the fever. "We built this cabin with our own 2 hands. He said we were building our future." "Sounds like a good man," Silas said softly. "The best," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "When Grace was born, that big, strong man just cried and cried. Said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever laid eyes on." She went quiet for a moment. "When he died, I felt like a part of me went with him. But I had to keep going. I had to do it for Grace." Grace came back with more water, and Silas got back to work. For hours, they fell into a rhythm. He cooled Clara's fever, while Grace kept the water fresh and the fire hot. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the stranger and the child worked together. As night fell, Clara's breathing seemed to get a little easier. Silas felt a small flicker of hope. "Is she going to be okay?" Grace asked from a chair by the bed. Her own feet were now wrapped in strips from Silas's spare shirt. I don't know for sure, Silas told her honestly. The girl deserved the truth. But I'm going to do everything I can. You'll stay then? You won't leave us? Silas looked at her tired, hopeful face. He thought of all the reasons he should leave, all the walls he'd built around his heart. But then he remembered her grabbing his boot in the snow, begging him not to be like all the others who rode away. I'll stay, he said. As long as you need me. Grace looked him square in the eye, then gave a slow nod. I believe you. Just 3 words. But from a child who'd been turned away by everyone, they felt like the most important promise he'd ever made. He settled in for a long night. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, a woman fought for her life, watched over by her daughter, and a stranger. For the first time in 4 long years, Silas wasn't running from something. He was staying for someone. As the first light of dawn crept in, Silas was still there, wiping Clara's forehead. Grace had finally fallen asleep by the fire, exhausted. Clara's eyes fluttered open. They were clearer now. Grace? She asked, her voice weak. She's sleeping by the fire, Silas said. Clara turned her head, and a look of pure relief washed over her face when she saw her daughter was safe. How long have you been here? Since yesterday. Your little girl found me on the trail. I remember bits and pieces, she said. Her lips tried to form a smile. You made a bold promise, stranger. Well, I've been called a fool before. Might as well be a bold one. She tried to laugh, but it turned into a rough cough. Silas helped her sip some water. When she settled back down, she studied his face. You're not from around these parts. No, ma'am, just passing through. That had been the plan, anyway. He wasn't so sure what the plan was now. You need a real doctor, he said, changing the subject. I've done all I can, but that fever needs medicine. Dr. Holloway won't come without payment, Clara said flatly. We already owe him $40. How far is town? 10 miles. But with this storm... The storm's breaking, Silas said, looking out the small window. The snow's stopping. I can make it to Cedar Falls and back before dark. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. You'd ride 20 miles in this snow for us? Your daughter walked 3 miles barefoot, he said. I reckon I can handle 20 on a horse. He won't come without the money. Then I'll just have to convince him. How? Silas stood and checked his revolver out of pure habit. I spent 6 years as a deputy sheriff back in Kansas. I learned a thing or two about convincing folks. Clara's eyes went wide. You were a lawman. A long time ago, he said, moving to the door. Now listen, your girl is going to wake up scared finding me gone. You have to tell her I'm coming right back. Can you do that? I can try. Don't try. Do it, he said firmly. That child has been let down by everyone but you. She needs to know someone keeps their word. Why do you care so much? The question hit him hard. He thought of his own broken promises, of the family he'd lost because he was too proud to ask for help. Because someone should, he said, and right now, I'm all you've got. He stepped out into the quiet, snow-covered world. His horse, Copper, gave a soft nicker. Got a hard ride ahead of us, boy. The horse just tossed his head, ready for the challenge. A single light glowed in the cabin window. He figured Clara was still awake. That was good. She could keep an eye on little Grace. Silas swung his leg over Copper's saddle and nudged the horse north toward Cedar Falls. The snow was thick on the ground, but the horse moved steady. The quiet ride gave a man too much time to think. For 4 long years, he had been on the run. He told himself that keeping folks at arm's length was a sign of strength, not fear. But seeing that little girl, Grace, walking barefoot in the snow, and hearing how her neighbors had shut their doors on her, well, something inside him just broke. These folks didn't need thoughts and prayers. They needed real help, the kind that sticks around. He wasn't sure he was the man for that job anymore, but he was fixing to try. Cedar Falls appeared through the morning fog. a small town with about 40 buildings lining one main street. He saw the sign right away. Dr. Ezra Holloway. Silas tied up his horse and knocked hard on the door. It opened to a gray-haired man in his late 50s who looked mighty irritated. "Office opens at 9, he grumbled, trying to shut the door. Silas put his boot in the way. "I have a woman about to die 10 miles from here. She has had a fever for 3 days and is barely hanging on. She needs a doctor now, not in 2 hours." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" "Silas Brennan. I found her little girl on the road, 8 years old, begging for help after the Thorntons and others turned her away." A look of something, maybe shame, crossed the doctor's face. "You mean Clara Weston, the widow? Her husband passed last spring." Dr. Holloway's jaw went tight. "That family already owes me $40. I cannot keep working for nothing." "So you would let her die over $40? Silas asked, his voice low. "I have my own bills, Mr. Brennan. This is a business." Silas took a deep breath. Anger would not help Clara now. "What will it take for you to ride out there and give her a chance? A house call is $15. The medicine, if it is pneumonia, will be another $20, plus what she already owes." The doctor crossed his arms. "Call it $75 total." Silas pulled out his leather pouch and emptied everything he had. $37. "I will work off the rest," he said. "I can chop wood, mend fences, whatever you need. I'm a hard worker." The doctor just stared at the money. "Why would you work off a stranger's debt?" "Because her little girl asked for help and no one else would listen. Because I'm tired of the man I have been for the last 4 years. Silas held out the cash. "Take it or leave it. But that woman is running out of time." After a long moment, the doctor's expression softened just a bit. "You used to be a lawman." It was a statement, not a question. "Deputy sheriff, back in Kansas. I quit 4 years ago. Why? Because I failed the people who counted on me, and I could not live with that lie anymore." Dr. Holloway sighed and took the money. "Give me 10 minutes. Your horse can get water out back." The door closed. Silas watered copper, his mind racing back to the cabin. Was Clara still holding on? Was Grace all right? The not knowing was eating him alive, reminding him of Eleanor. He remembered racing home all those years ago, praying for a miracle that never came. "Mr. Brennan?" A well-dressed woman was standing nearby. "I am Edith Thornton. I hear you were at the Weston place." "I was. My husband, Hiram, he thought it was best not to get involved. We were worried about sickness spreading." Silas just looked at her. "Your husband made that real clear when he shut the door on a barefoot 8-year-old girl." Mrs. Thornton flinched. "That is not fair. Hiram can be a hard man, but we have given that family plenty. We paid for her husband's funeral. We brought food." "And then you stopped when it got hard," Silas said flatly. "You do not understand how things are out here," she snapped. "We cannot carry everyone. If folks cannot make it on their own, well, then their children wander in the snow, begging strangers for help." Silas finished for her. Her face went pale. He saw Dr. Holloway come out with his medical bag. "Excuse me, ma'am. I have to be somewhere." As he and the doctor rode away, Mrs. Thornton called out, "Tell Clara I will visit when she is feeling better." Silas did not bother to answer. Talk is cheap. He would believe it when he saw it. The ride back to the cabin felt like it took forever. When they finally saw smoke curling from the chimney, Silas could breathe again. He pushed the door open to find Grace standing there, tears on her face, holding a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. "Grace, it is me!" The skillet dropped to the floor with a clang. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You came back," she sobbed. "You really came back. I told you I would. I woke up and you were gone, and Mama was so sick." "I know what you thought," Silas said, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "But I gave you my word. And I always keep my word. You understand me?" Grace nodded. Then she saw Dr. Holloway standing behind him. The relief on Grace's face soured as soon as she saw the doctor. "You brought him? He said we owed too much money." Dr. Holloway cleared his throat. Grace, your mother's debt has been handled. I am here now. Her eyes shot from the doctor to Silas. You paid him? How? Silas just shook his head. Do not you worry about that now. From the bed, Clara's weak voice cut in. Grace, let the doctor work. While the doctor examined her, Silas tended to Grace's feet with fresh bandages. He will make her well, she whispered. He will try his hardest, Silas replied. What if that is not enough? Silas thought of a time when a doctor's best was not enough. We will face that together if we have to. For now, your mama has a real chance. That is what matters. Dr. Holloway finally stood, his face grim but not without hope. It is pneumonia in both lungs. The dehydration made it much worse. He set out several bottles. I have medicines for the fever and her lungs. Is she going to live? Grace's voice was a tiny whisper. The doctor looked at the little girl with a flash of real compassion. Your mother is very sick, child. Another 12 hours and I could not have helped her. But now she has a fighting chance. These next 24 hours are the most important. What does she need? Silas asked. Rest, fluids, and medicine on time. She needs someone to watch her all night long. The doctor looked right at Silas. I am staying. For how long? Silas glanced at Grace's terrified face. As long as it takes. The doctor nodded. I will return tomorrow. If her fever breaks tonight, her odds are good. If it does not... He let the words hang in the air and handed Silas a paper with instructions. Follow this exactly. Before he left, the doctor knelt beside Grace. I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you. I was wrong. He offered her a small peppermint stick. This is not enough, but I am truly sorry. Grace just looked at him. My mama says sorry is useless unless you change what you did wrong. Are you going to change? Are you going to help people who cannot pay? The simple question from the child hit the doctor hard. He stood up slowly, looking like a man who had just been judged. I am going to try, he said. Grace considered his answer, then took the candy. I reckon trying is better than nothing. Trying is... Silas gave Clara the first dose of medicine while Grace warmed some broth over the fire. Outside, the sun was shining, which felt like a cruel joke. Clara drifted in and out, lost in her fever. Samuel? She murmured, reaching a hand toward Silas. Samuel, is that you? Silas saw the hurt on Grace's face. No, ma'am. My name is Silas. He spoke softly. Samuel is not here right now, but your daughter is. Grace is right here with you. Grace? Clara's eyes searched the dim cabin. I am here, Mama. Grace rushed to the bed and took her mother's hand. I am not going anywhere. Clara's face relaxed, the confusion leaving her. My good girl. My brave girl. What would I do without you? You will not have to find out. Mr. Brennan brought the doctor. You are going to get better. Did he? Clara's gaze moved to Silas. And what does Mr. Brennan say? I say you are too stubborn to die and too ornery to give up. A weak laugh escaped her lips. Ornery. Grace tells me that is what her papa used to say about me. Her eyes softened with the memory. Stubborn as a mule and twice as pretty, he would say. Silas pulled a chair closer to the bed. Tell me about him. Tell me about Samuel. Grace looked surprised, but Clara did not hesitate. Talking about her husband seemed as natural as breathing. She told stories of how they met, of their dreams of heading west, and of raising their daughter in this very cabin. She spoke of hard times and good times, painting a picture of the life they had built together. Grace sat perfectly still, soaking in every word. As exhaustion finally took over, Clara's words began to slur. He would have liked you, I think. Samuel was a good judge of character. I hope I would have earned his trust, Silas said quietly. You are here, are you not? You stayed when everyone else left us. Her eyes closed as the medicine pulled her to sleep. That counts for a lot, Mr. Brennan. After she was asleep, Grace watched her mother's chest rise and fall. Mr. Brennan, when Mama gets better, what will happen then? Are you going to leave? It was the one question Silas had been avoiding. I do not know, Grace. Mama will need help when she is getting strong again, Grace said, her voice small. I am too little for some of the work, and maybe we need somebody, and maybe you do not have anywhere else to be. Silas looked at this child who had walked through a blizzard for her mother, who had been turned away by everyone, but never gave up. Let us get your mama well first, he said carefully. Then we will talk about what comes next. But you will think about it? About staying? He thought about the lonely road, about 4 years of running from his past. Yeah, he said softly. I will think about it. A real smile finally lit up Grace's face. Good, she said. That is good. The long hours slowly passed. Silas kept the medicine schedule perfectly. He gave Clara water and kept a cool cloth on her forehead. The fever was high but steady. It was not better, but it was not worse. They were about 8 hours into the critical time. Silas knew he would not sleep that night. He had a promise to keep. Sometime deep in the night, long after Grace had fallen asleep, Clara's hand found his in the dark. You are still here, she murmured. I told you I would be. Most folks do not keep their word. I know, he said. Why do you? Silas thought about her question. He thought about all the people who had refused to help this family. Because, he said at last, I used to be someone who did not. I let down the folks who needed me most, and I have lived with the cost of that every single day for 4 years. He looked at Clara. I cannot change my past. I cannot bring back who I lost, but I can choose to be a better man right now. I can choose to show up. Clara was quiet, her thumb gently stroking his hand. What did you lose? My wife, he said, the words catching in his throat. And my son. He was born too soon. She died trying to bring him into this world. I was supposed to be there, but I was out chasing some outlaw. By the time I got home, he could not finish. I am so sorry, Clara whispered. That is a heavy burden to carry. It is, he agreed. Does it ever get lighter? Silas looked at her, a woman who knew loss just as well as he did. I do not know yet, he said honestly. But being here tonight, making sure you keep breathing, watching your little girl sleep, knowing her mama will be here in the morning, he had to swallow hard. This helps a whole lot. So whole. Clara held onto his hand. Then stay, she whispered. As long as this helps, just stay. He didn't have to answer. The promise was already made, unspoken. Outside, the world was cold and vast. But inside that little cabin, a fire was burning. A broken man was keeping watch, finding out that sometimes the only way to heal yourself is to stay right where you are needed. For hours, Silas sat there, in a cabin that wasn't his, with a family that wasn't his. And he started to wonder if maybe belonging wasn't something you were born into. Maybe it was something you chose. Dawn came gray and slow. Silas was bone-tired, but it did not matter. Around 4 in the morning, the fever had broken. He felt the exact moment her skin went from burning hot to just damp with sweat, the moment her breathing finally eased into a real healing sleep. When Grace woke up, her eyes shot straight to her mother's bed, full of hope and fear. Silas gave her a small, tired smile. Her fever broke a few hours ago. The little girl scrambled over, placing a hand on her mother's forehead. She is not hot anymore, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. The worst is over, kid. The worst is over. He turned to look at her, and the trust in Grace's eyes hit him right in the gut. You saved her, she said, her voice full of awe. The doctor did the saving. I just kept her breathing. Grace shook her head. No. He gave her medicine. You gave her a reason to live. Silas felt a knot in his chest and stood up to stretch his sore muscles. We need more wood. The storm knocked plenty down. You stay here with your mama. You know the medicine if she wakes? Yes, sir. 2 drops of the laudanum, 1 spoon of the fever mix, and all the water she can drink. Good girl. I'll be back in an hour. The cold outside was a welcome shock after the stuffy cabin. It felt clean. From the lean-to, his horse Copper gave a soft nicker. Silas checked the animal's feed and water before heading into the woods. The work was simple, just what he needed. He had only planned to help a sick woman and move on. A simple good deed, no strings attached. But the Westons were not simple. Grace, with her fierce spirit and old eyes. Clara, with her quiet pride. They had gotten under his skin without even trying, making him feel things he had sworn off for good. He was in deep trouble. By the time he got back with a load of wood, Clara was sitting up in bed, sipping broth. Mr. Brennan? Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. Grace tells me I owe you my life. Your daughter did all the hard work. I just happened by. Don't you dare, Clara said, setting her cup down with surprising force. Don't you downplay what you did. Grace told me everything. How you rode through that storm, how you paid the doctor with your last cent, how you stayed up all night just to make sure I was still breathing. Her voice went soft. That is not just happening by. That is more than anyone has done for us since Samuel passed. Silas busied himself stacking the wood, uneasy with the gratitude he saw in her. I did what anyone would have. No, Clara said, her jaw tight. They would not have. They did not. Grace went to 4 different homesteads begging for help before she found you. 4. Every last one of them turned her away. So do not tell me anyone would have done it, because I know better. For 8 months I have seen how folks truly are. The bitterness in her voice cut right through him. He stopped his work and faced her. You are right. I am sorry. I know you did not mean it like that. I know you are a humble man. But Grace, she needs to see that good men still exist. Right now, you are the only proof she has. Silas glanced at Grace, who was watching them with a solemn look. A heavy weight settled on his shoulders. I do not know how long I am staying, he said slowly. I made a promise for the crisis. And after that? Clara held his gaze. After that, we figure it out. I am not asking for forever, Mr. Brennan. I am just asking for the truth. If you plan on leaving, tell us now. Do not let us get used to you and then just vanish. Her directness was not a challenge, it was a relief. I am staying until you are recovered, he said. At least that long. Then we will see what makes sense. Clara nodded. Fair enough. But I intend to pay you back every cent you gave that doctor. This family does not accept charity. It is not charity if it is a choice. It is charity if I cannot pay it back. Then pay me back by getting well. Pay me back by taking care of yourself so that little girl does not lose her mother, too. His voice was rougher than he meant. That is payment enough. Clara's eyes welled up, but she did not cry. Silas was learning this woman had turned her tears into pure grit long ago. Mr. Brennan? Call me Silas. If I am staying, you might as well use my name. Silas, she said, testing the word. I want you to know something. No matter what happens, you have already given us back something I thought was lost forever. What is that? Hope. Clara looked over at Grace, who was curled up by the fire reading a book. Look at her. For the first time in 8 months, she is not carrying the weight of the whole world. She is just a little girl because she knows someone else is here to help carry the load. Silas looked, and he saw it was true. Grace's face was relaxed, lost in her story. She was not watching her mother, not listening for every pained breath. She was just a girl reading a book. Seeing that cracked something open inside of Silas. I had a daughter, he heard himself say. Or I almost did. My wife, Eleanor. She was 8 months along. The baby came too soon, too small. I lost them both within hours. Clara drew a sharp breath but stayed quiet. After that, I could not stay in that house we built, in the nursery she painted. I quit my job as a deputy and just started writing. That was 4 years ago. I have not stopped since. What made you stop now? Your daughter. She grabbed my boot out there in the snow and just would not let go. His voice cracked. She looked at me like I was the last hope on earth, and the wall I had built around myself just crumbled. I could not ride away. I could not do to her what everyone else had done. Because you know how it feels to be left alone when you need help the most. No. I know how it feels to fail the ones who count on you. That is what I know. I was not there when Eleanor needed me, he said, finally meeting Clara's eyes. I was off chasing some outlaw, playing the hero instead of being a husband. By the time I made it back, it was too late. That was not your fault. That was just bad timing. Was it? Or was it the choices I made that put me there? I have had 4 years to think on it, and I keep coming back to the same answer. I chose wrong. I chose my job over my family, and they paid the price. Clara was quiet for a long moment. I spent 3 months after my Samuel died asking those same kinds of questions. What if I had made him rest that day? What if he had not helped our neighbors? What if? She shifted in the bed, wincing. And you know what I learned from all that wondering? What? That what if is a trap. It keeps you living in a past you cannot change instead of the present where you can still do some good. Clara reached out a hand, and her voice was steady, over his where it lay on the chair's arm. You can't bring back your wife. You can't meet that child you never held. But you can be here for the folks who need you now. That ain't running from your failures. That's learning from them. Silas just stared at her hand on his, at how pale and weak her fingers looked against his own weathered skin. You talk like you got it all mapped out. I talk like someone who's fought this same fight and made it to the other side. Clara gave a faint smile. I still miss Samuel every single day. I even talk to him when Grace ain't around to hear. But I quit asking what if. The answer doesn't change a thing. What matters is getting up each day for the people who are still here. And you think I can do that? After 4 years of running, I think you're already doing it. You just haven't admitted it to yourself. Before he could answer, a knock on the door made them both jump. Grace shot up from her book, all tensed up, the peace of the cabin gone in an instant. Stay put, Silas said, moving toward the door. His hand was on his revolver, not drawn, but ready. He opened it, to see Mrs. Thornton on the porch, wrapped in a thick coat and holding a big basket. A hired man stood behind her with a cart full of supplies. Mr. Brennan. Her voice was shaky, nothing like the hard woman he'd faced in town. I've come to see Clara, to apologize. Silas blocked the doorway. She's mending. Might not be up for company. I brought food, she said, her voice Russian. Flour, sugar, salt pork, dried apples, and some herbs from my garden. Her eyes were shiny, maybe with tears. I know it don't fix what we did, what Hiram did, but I couldn't just sit there knowing that little girl walked barefoot in the snow because of us. Edith. Clara's voice floated from inside. Edith, is that you? Mrs. Thornton's face just crumpled. Oh, Clara, I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. I should have stood up to Hiram. You should come inside, Clara said. It's too cold to be sorry on the porch. Silas stepped aside. Grace stood stiff as a board by the fire, her face a mask. Mrs. Thornton, Clara said, you remember my daughter. The woman turned to Grace, and Silas saw her take in the bandaged feet, the thin dress, the watchful eyes. Any wall she had built around herself just fell to pieces. Grace, honey, I am so sorry. Mrs. Thornton knelt, getting down to the girl's level. When you came to our door, I should have helped you. I should have done what was right. Can you ever forgive me? Grace just looked at her for a long time. Then her eyes moved to Silas, asking him what to do. That's up to you, Silas said softly. Nobody can tell you how you ought to feel. Grace turned back to Mrs. Thornton. Mama says Sorry don't mean a thing if you don't change what you're sorry for. Your mama is right. So, what are you going to change? The question hung in the quiet room. I'm going to speak up when it's hard, she said at last. I'm going to help my neighbors, even if my husband says we can't spare it. I'm going to remember we're all struggling together. You promise? I promise. Grace thought on it with a serious look. Then she gave one sharp nod. All right, I reckon everyone deserves a second chance. That's what Mr. Brennan says. Mrs. Thornton looked at Silas, her eyes full of wonder. You've made a real impression on this family. They've made one on me. The next hour was a blur. Mrs. Thornton had her man unload the supplies while she fussed over Clara, checking her fever and fixing her pillows. The two women talked like old friends, patching up a bridge that had been broken for years. Grace watched it all, sometimes looking over at Silas, just to make sure he was still there. He would nod, and she'd relax a little more. When Mrs. Thornton was ready to leave, she pulled Silas aside. Hiram don't know I'm here. He'd be fit to be tied. Then why'd you come? Because my husband being wrong don't mean I have to be. She pulled her coat tight. For 30 years, I've let him decide for the both of us. But seeing that child beg for help, and then seeing you ride into town demanding Dr. Holloway do his job, she shook her head. It woke something up in me. What will you do? I don't know yet. But I can't keep pretending nothing matters but keeping Hiram calm. Mrs. Thornton met his gaze. You take care of them, Mr. Brennan. I intend to. After she left, the cabin felt different, fuller. The shelves were lined with enough food to last for weeks. That was something, Clara said from the bed. She's trying. I know. I'd given up on people trying. Her eyes found his. First you, now Edith. Maybe the world ain't as cold as I thought. That night they ate their first real meal as a family. Grace, a good little cook for an 8-year-old, had made biscuits from the new flour. Silas heated up salt pork with dried apples. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it was shared around the small table that Samuel Weston had built with his own hands. Clara was still too frail for the table, so Grace brought a plate to her bedside. The three of them ate in a comfortable quiet. Mr. Silas, Grace finally said, testing the name. When my mama gets well, will you teach me to ride for real? Not just sitting on a horse someone's leading. Her sentence about her papa trailed off, left unsaid. Silas looked at Clara, who gave a slight nod. Once your mama is stronger and your feet have healed up, I'll teach you, he said. Copper is a gentle horse, and you have the grit for it. Grace's face beamed. Truly? It is hard work, mind you. You will take some tumbles and get mighty sore. I do not quit. I believe it. Then a sound Silas had not heard before. Clara let out a real laugh. It washed the sorrow from her face, giving a peek at the woman she was before all the hardship. She is telling the truth, Clara said. That child has never backed down from a single thing. Stubborn is not a strong enough word for her. Cannot imagine where she gets it from, Silas said with a dry smile. Clara's eyebrows shot up. Are you calling me stubborn, Mr. Brennan? I am saying a woman who survives a Montana winter alone with a child, works herself sick for this homestead, and still argues about a little help. Well, she is not known for giving up easy. Fair enough. Her smile softened. Samuel always said I could outstubborn a mule. The air between them felt warm. Silas saw little Grace watching them, her eyes full of hope, and knew his next move mattered. Silas, Clara said softly, whether you stay or go, you need to know you have changed everything for us. You do not really know me, but I know you stayed up all night just to make sure I was still breathing. I know you gave every last dollar to help a stranger, and I know you are the first person in 8 months to truly see my daughter. Her voice wavered. That tells me who you are. Grace had been listening with the knowing eyes of a child who grew up too fast. Are you going to stay? She asked directly. Not just until Mama's better. I mean, forever. Silas looked at the girl who had walked through a blizzard, at the woman who fought so hard, and at the small cabin that was starting to feel like a home. Forever is a mighty long time to promise, he said honestly. Her face fell just a bit. That is fair, I reckon. But I can promise this. I'm not going anywhere until I know you are both safe, until your mama is strong again. He met her eyes. And I promise I will always come back. That is not something I have said to anyone in 4 years. You promise? I promise. That seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once and went back to her biscuit. Clara watched them both. Silas could not quite read the look on her face. Her voice was just a whisper. I think you are already home, Silas Brennan. You just have not realized it yet. He could not find any words to answer. Deep down in that place he had kept locked up for 4 years, something was shifting. It felt an awful lot like belonging, and it was terrifying. Outside, the Montana wind howled, but inside, the fire burned warm and bright. 3 people, strangers just 48 hours ago, were becoming something unexpected. A broken family, being put back together. And Silas, who had spent years running from this very thing, began to wonder if maybe he had been running toward it all along. 2 weeks went by, and Clara's strength returned each day. She could walk around the cabin and handle small tasks. The doctor said her recovery was remarkable. Silas fell into a steady rhythm. He was up at dawn, tending to the horse and making repairs on the cabin. The hard work kept his hands busy while his mind wrestled with things he could not solve. You are brooding again, Clara said one morning from her chair by the window. I can tell by the way you are attacking that wood pile. Silas stopped his swing, the axe buried deep in a log. I do not brood. Yes, you do. You get a look on your face like you are arguing with someone who is not there. A small smile touched her lips. My husband used to do that. What did you do about it? He asked. I made him talk, she said, pulling her shawl tighter. So are you going to tell me what is eating at you, or should I guess? He freed the axe and split the log with a sharp crack. Nothing is eating at me. Liar. The word was so plain and true that Silas had to laugh. Are you always this direct? Life is too short to dance around things, she said. Something changed in the last few days. You are quieter. Grace noticed it too. She asked me if she did something wrong. That hit him hard. The thought of Grace thinking she was the cause made his chest tighten. She did not do anything wrong. Then what is it? Silas drove the axe into the chopping block and turned to face her. She looked healthier with color back in her cheeks, but now he had put a worried look in her eyes. He hated that he was the cause of it. I got a letter, he said at last. Picked it up in town yesterday. It is from the sheriff back in Kansas, a man named Garrett. Silas pulled the folded paper from his pocket but did not open it. He has been trying to find me for 3 years. He finally did. Weariness crept into Clara's expression. What does he want? He wants me to come back. A gang is hitting the railroad, with the same pattern as one I was tracking before I left. He says they need someone who knows the territory and how these men think. Silas looked at the letter. Says they need me. A heavy silence stretched between them. Are you going to go? Clara's voice was carefully neutral. I do not know. When do they need an answer? The letter is dated 3 weeks ago. By now they have either solved it, or they are waiting on a miracle. What do you want to do? The question cut right to the heart of it all. For 4 years, wanting things had felt like a weakness. He had trained himself to need nothing. But now, with Clara watching him and Grace inside, the old numbness was gone. He wanted things that scared him. I want to stay, he admitted. I want to finish fixing this place. I want to teach Grace to ride, like I promised. I want to see you get strong again. He took a breath, the next words coming out harder. I want to stop running. I just do not know how." Clara pushed herself up from the chair and walked slowly toward him. When she reached him, she gently took the letter from his hands. "May I?" He nodded. She read it in silence, her expression giving nothing away. When she finished, she looked up at him. She folded it and handed it back. "They're just asking for help on one case, I know, and you feel like you owe them since you started it." "Partly." "What's the other part?" Silas stared out at the mountains. "Part of me thinks I don't deserve this. A family, a home. Part of me thinks I should go back to the only thing I was ever good at, hunting men. And the part that wants to stay, that part is scared stiff. Because the last time I let myself belong somewhere, I lost it all. And I don't know if I can live through that again." Clara's hand found his, her fingers weaving with his. It was a comfort he'd grown used to. He'd stopped pulling away from her touch after the first week. "Silas, look at me." He turned to her. Her eyes were burning with a fire he couldn't quite name. "You are not the same man who lost his family. You have spent 4 years becoming someone else. Someone who stops for a crying child. Someone who gives everything he has to save strangers. Who keeps his promises no matter how hard." Her grip got tighter. "That man don't have to go back to Kansas to prove he's worth something. He's already proven it right here. Clara, I ain't finished." Her voice cracked. "If you go back because you have to finish that case, then you go. Grace and I will be here when you get back. But if you're going because you think you don't deserve to stay, because you're still punishing yourself for what happened 4 years ago, then don't. Don't you dare use duty as an excuse to run from something that scares you." Her words hit him hard, finding every sore spot he had. "How do you know me so well?" he asked, his voice low. "We've only known each other a few weeks, because I recognize that look in your eyes. It's the same look I saw in the mirror for months after Samuel died. The look of someone who thinks they failed so bad that happiness just ain't for them anymore. I was wrong about that. And so are you." Before Silas could answer, the door flew open and Grace came running out, her face all lit up. "Silas, Mama, someone is coming. A big old wagon is heading down the trail." They looked, and sure enough, a wagon was cutting a path through the snow toward them. As it got closer, Silas recognized the man driving. He was a heavy-set fellow from town who looked like he was used to getting his way. "That is Hiram Thornton," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Edith's husband, the one who ran Grace off." Silas moved to stand a little in front of Clara, a gut feeling he did not bother to question. Thornton pulled his team to a halt and climbed down with a groan. "Mrs. Weston," he said, tipping his hat like he was forced to, "I am here on business." "Business?" Clara's voice was like ice. "Your husband owed me $200 for equipment and livestock when he died. I gave him the credit last spring. I have been patient, but my patience is wearing thin." Silas felt Clara go stiff next to him. "Samuel paid you $50 before he passed on. You said that cleared the debt. I said no such thing. Your husband might have thought so, but my records say different. $200, Mrs. Weston. I need it by spring, or I will have to take other measures." "What measures?" "This land, the cabin, all the work your husband put in. It all adds up. If you cannot pay, I will have every right to claim this property." Grace's little hand grabbed Silas's coat and held on tight. "You cannot do that," the girl said, her voice shaking but full of fight. "This is our home. Papa built it." "Grace," Clara warned gently, "let me handle this." But her little hand did not let go of Silas's coat. "Mr. Thornton, my Samuel was a man who wrote everything down. If you have papers saying we owe $200, I'd sure like to see them against his ledgers. I reckon his numbers will be the right ones." Clara's voice was soft, but it had an edge like sharpened steel. "You bring me your proof and I will have an answer for you. Until then, you can keep your talk of taking my property to yourself." Thornton's face flushed with anger, clearly not used to a widow standing up to him. Silas stepped up then, his voice low but firm. "The lady asked for your papers. I think you should get them and be on your way." Thornton glared. "And just who are you?" "The name is Silas Brennan. I am helping the family out." Thornton sneered. Helping? That is what you call it? Town has been buzzing about the stranger staying with the widow. Folks ought to mind their own affairs, Silas said, a coldness creeping into his voice. It is hard to do when there is indecency happening in plain sight. An unmarried man and woman under one roof with a child. That is enough, Hiram, Clara cut in, moving right between them. My home is my business. If you think spreading nasty rumors will help you steal this land from me and my girl, you have got another thing coming. I have got nothing to hide. Thornton's face turned a deep shade of purple. You will be sorry for this, Clara. The only thing I am sorry about is ever thinking you were a friend, she said, her voice steady as a rock. Now get off my property. Thornton looked from her set jaw to the quiet man standing behind her and seemed to think better of it. He scrambled onto his wagon. You have got till spring, he yelled back. $200, or I am taking what is mine by law. They stood in silence until his wagon was just a speck on the horizon. Little Grace finally let go of Silas's coat. Mama, is he going to take our house? Clara knelt and hugged her tight. No, sweet girl. Your daddy did not owe him that much, and I can prove it. We will figure it out. You trust me. Grace nodded, but her worried eyes met Silas's over her mother's shoulder. He gave a slow, firm nod that said more than words ever could. Once Grace was inside, Clara's strong front crumbled a little. He is a liar, Silas. Samuel paid that debt off. It was $50 and Thornton called it square. Do you have Samuel's ledgers? Yes, but Thornton is a big man around here, even with proof. Getting the law to side with a widow against him will not be easy. And he brought up the rumors about us. A flash of anger crossed Clara's face. Let them talk. I have got bigger worries than town gossips. It could cause trouble for you and Grace, Silas cautioned. And what should I do? Tell the man who saved our lives to leave so the neighbors will stop whispering? No, I would rather be the subject of gossip than be in my grave, Silas. Her jaw set hard. You are staying. That is not up for discussion. What they think is their problem, not ours. She walked back to the cabin, her back straight and proud. Silas watched her, his thoughts a whirlwind of Thornton's threats, the whispers in town, and a letter from Kansas that felt a lifetime away. Later that night, they hunched over Samuel's ledger by the fire. Just as she had said, his records were perfect. Clara's finger landed on an entry. There, last April, $50 paid to H. Thornton, loan settled in full. She read Samuel's own note aloud. He shook my hand on it. So he is lying through his teeth, Silas said. Of course he is. Clara's voice turned hard. He has wanted this land for years to grow his own ranch. Samuel always knew he would try something, just not against a woman and her child. We can take this to the judge, Silas said. Prove him wrong. Clara looked at him, her hope warring with fear. I cannot make that trip alone, not yet. And even then, a woman's word against a man like him. Silas knew exactly what she meant. I will go with you, he said. When you're ready, we will go together. But what about Kansas? Your letter? He watched the fire for a minute. Kansas has waited 3 years. It can wait some more. I told you I would stay until you were safe, and you are not safe yet. The relief that washed over her face almost hurt to see. Are you sure? With all the talk. With Thornton. I am sure, he said, taking her hand. I have spent years running from everything, Clara. Running from responsibility, from caring about anyone. I am just tired of it. I am tired of being alone. Her fingers tightened around his. What does this mean, Silas? It means I am staying. Not because of a promise, but because this is where I want to be, with you and Grace. I want to build something instead of running from it. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling. You know, Samuel would have called you a fool, stepping into a fight that is not yours for a widow and a child. What would you say? He asked. I would say you are the bravest man I know, she whispered, And I thank the good Lord every day that Grace found you." He leaned in. "Clara, I have to tell you something." He took a breath. "I am falling in love with you." The words felt huge in the quiet room. He rushed to continue. "You do not have to say it back. I know it is too soon." But she stopped his words with a kiss, soft and questioning. Her hand moved to his cheek, and the kiss became an answer. When they finally broke apart, she was crying and laughing at the same time. "I was wondering when you would figure that out," she whispered. "I was hoping," she said. "After Samuel passed, I thought that part of my life was just over, that I would just be surviving for Grace. Then you showed up. Clara, I am damaged from what happened back in Kansas. I am not a whole man." She smiled, a real beautiful smile through her tears. "Well, neither am I. Nobody who has really lived is. But sometimes, Silas, broken pieces fit together just right. They can make something even stronger than before." He pulled her into his arms, holding on tight as the wind howled outside, feeling her heart beat right there next to his. But inside that little cabin, there was warmth and light and a feeling of hope. "What do we do now?" he asked her softly. "Now we fight Thornton. We make this place into something Grace can be proud of. And we face whatever is coming together, not alone." Clara looked him square in the eyes. "And along the way, we figure out how to be a real family, the only kind worth having." Silas kissed her, sealing a promise that had been growing since he first answered a little girl's cry for help. For 4 years, he had been running from love and loss. But here, with this woman and her daughter, he finally understood he had really been running from hope. The terrifying, wonderful idea that happiness was not done with him yet. And now that he had found it, he was not letting go. The morning they went to Cedar Falls for the hearing, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Silas helped Clara into the wagon Edith Thornton had insisted they borrow, even though her husband was furious. Grace sat between them, holding Samuel's account books like they were treasure. "You nervous?" Silas asked Clara. "Terrified," she admitted. "Thornton has money and influence. We just have these ledger books and the word of a widow." "You have got the truth," he said. "The truth does not always win, Silas." He knew she was right. "But it is going to win today," he said. Grace looked up at him with her serious eyes. "You promise?" "I promise I will do everything I can to make sure it does." She nodded. "That is enough. Mama says honest promises are the only ones worth making." The courthouse was a plain 2-story wooden building. Judge Harrison, a fair man with sharp eyes, was already inside. Thornton was there too, with 2 of his ranch hands, looking smug like he had already won. "Mrs. Weston," he said with a fake smile, "I see you brought your friend." "Mr. Brennan is here as a witness," Clara replied, her voice cool. "And so is my daughter, a child and a drifter. Impressive. Better than a liar and his hired thugs." Before Thornton could answer, Judge Harrison called the room to order. The hearing went about how Silas figured it would. Thornton made his claim for $200, showing papers that looked suspiciously new. Then it was Clara's turn. She stood up slow and careful. She approached the judge's bench holding Samuel's old account books. Her voice was steady as she explained every payment her husband had made. "And this entry right here," she said, pointing to a line from April, "is the final payment of $50. Mr. Thornton himself said it settled the debt." They shook hands on it. "She is lying," Thornton boomed. $50 was just a partial payment. "Then why did you not send a single bill in the 8 months before my husband died?" Clara's voice got sharp. "This is not about a debt, Hiram. This is about you wanting our land and using a widow's grief to try and steal it." The room went dead silent. Thornton's face turned purple with rage. Judge Harrison held up a hand for quiet. He looked closely at Thornton's papers and then at Samuel's worn ledger. Mr. Thornton, he said at last, your paperwork shows a debt, but there is no payment schedule, no letters asking for money. Mrs. Weston's books, however, show a clear history, including a final payment her husband marked as settling all accounts. The judge's eyes were like chips of ice. Either Mr. Weston was a fantastic storyteller, or your claim is not worth the paper it is printed on. Your Honor, I object. I am not finished, the judge cut him off. I have known you for 20 years, Hiram. I have seen how you do business. You use pressure, and debts have a funny way of showing up after a man is gone. Thornton went pale. The judge then turned to Clara. Mrs. Weston, is there anyone who can confirm your story about this handshake agreement? I can. The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Edith Thornton stood in the doorway, her hands shaking but her face full of resolve. I was there when Samuel paid. I heard my husband say $50 would make them even, and I will swear to it on an oath. You could have heard a pin drop. Hiram Thornton just stared at his wife. Edith, what are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago. She walked to the front, her steps getting steadier. I am telling the truth, Hiram. Something you have forgotten how to do. She stopped and stood right next to Clara. For 30 years, I have watched you take advantage of people. Not anymore. Back. I ain't having any part of this. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, looking a mite surprised. Well, now that changes things. He shuffled his papers, buying a moment to think. Mrs. Thornton, are you ready to give a formal statement? I am. Then let's hear it. Edith's words were short, but they hit like a hammer. She told the court about the handshake deal and how her husband never expected another dime. She said his claim against Clara was born from pure greed. When she finished, Judge Harrison gave his verdict right then and there. The claim is dismissed. Mr. Thornton, I suggest you think hard on how you do business. He banged his gavel and court was over. The room started buzzing, but Silas didn't hear a thing. He just watched Clara's shoulders finally relax after all these months. He watched Grace throw her little arms around her mama, a joy so big it barely fit inside her. They had won. They had truly won. Silas hung back, giving them their moment, but Clara's eyes found his. She mouthed two simple words across the room. Thank you. He just gave a small shake of his head. This was her victory, hers and her daughter's, with help from a woman brave enough to stand against her own husband. He was just here for support. But when Clara walked toward him, her face shining with relief, Silas felt a wall inside him crumble. The last one he'd been holding on to. We won, Clara said, her voice soft. You won, he corrected. I just watched. You did more than watch, she insisted. You stayed. You fought with us. You made me believe we could do it. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. I couldn't have done this without you. Yes, you could have. You're the strongest woman I know. Maybe. But being strong by yourself and being strong with someone beside you are two different things. Clara's eyes were glistening. I'm tired of being strong alone, Silas. I want to be strong with you. Before he could say a word, a tiny whirlwind crashed into them. It was Grace, her face wet with happy tears and split by a huge smile. We get to keep our home. We get to stay. We do, sweet girl. Clara hugged her daughter with one arm, keeping her other hand right on Silas's chest. We get to stay, and Silas, too. He gets to stay. Clara looked up at him, her daughter's question now in her own eyes. Yeah, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. I get to stay, too. Grace let out a whoop and hugged them both even tighter. Over her head, Silas and Clara shared a look that was a promise, a future that neither of them had dared to dream of until now. The ride back to the cabin felt brand new. The heavy weight was gone, replaced by a feeling so light it was almost giddy. Grace chattered the whole way, making plans for the garden and all the things they could do now. Clara sat close to Silas, her shoulder pressed against his. They didn't need to talk much. The quiet between them was peaceful now, full of understanding instead of worry. When the cabin came into view, Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. What is it? Clara asked. Nothing's wrong. He hopped down, helped her, and then Grace to the ground. But instead of walking to the cabin, he turned to face them. "There's something I need to say to both of you." Grace's face puckered with worry. "Is it bad?" "No, sweetheart, it's not bad." He knelt down to her level. "You asked me once if I was going to stay forever. I told you I didn't know, because forever is a long time. I remember. Well, I've been thinking on it, and I figured something out." He took her small hands in his. "Forever isn't about how long, it's about choosing. It's about waking up each day and deciding to be there for the folks that matter to you." "Grace, I want to be there for you, every single day for as long as you'll have me. I want to teach you to ride, help with your reading, and watch you grow." Tears were rolling down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Does that mean you're going to be my pa?" Silas felt his throat tighten. He looked at Clara, who was crying freely now, her hand over her mouth. "That's not just my decision," he said gently. "Your mama and I would need to talk about that." "I've already talked about it," Clara said, cutting in, "with myself and with God." She knelt down beside them, putting her hand on Silas's shoulder. "Grace, how would you feel about Silas officially becoming part of our family?" Grace launched herself at Silas, knocking him right back into the snow. Her little arm squeezed his neck as she laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes, I want that more than anything." Silas held her close, feeling her small body tremble with joy. Something inside him that had been frozen for 4 long years finally melted away. He never thought he'd have this again. The love of a child, the trust of a family. But here it was, his family. Clara's arms wrapped around them both. "So, is that a yes?" she asked, laughing through her own tears. "You'll marry me, make this official?" "Clara Weston, I'd marry you right here in this snow if you'd let me. I'd rather it be the church if it's all the same. I think Grace wants to wear her good dress." "I do." Grace pulled back, her face all lit up. "Can we have a cake? And can Mrs. Thornton come?" She stood up for us. "Edith can come," Clara promised. "We'll have a cake and anything else you want. This is a celebration." They finally made their way inside, soaked from the snow, but not caring one bit. Silas built up the fire while Grace danced around, planning the wedding, and Clara just watched them, a look of pure peace on her face. Later that night, after Grace was fast asleep, Silas and Clara sat by the fire. "You sure about this?" Silas asked quietly. "I'm still healing from things." Clara stopped his words with a kiss. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She pulled back and looked him in the eye. "We're both carrying scars, Silas. That doesn't mean we can't be happy. It just means we know what it's worth. Samuel would have liked you. He would have trusted you with us." Her voice was soft but certain. "I've made my peace with lovin' again. Have you?" Silas thought about the life he'd lost, the grief that had chased him across 6 territories. Then he thought about Grace grabbing his boot in the snow, and Clara fighting for her home. He thought about how this family had pieced him back together. "Yeah," he said at last, "I have." They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Cedar Falls. Grace stood next to her mother, holding a bunch of early spring flowers. Dr. Holloway was there, and so was Edith Thornton, who came alone. Her husband had skipped town to avoid the shame. "Do you, Silas Brennan, take this woman to be your wife?" Silas looked at Clara, at the joy in her eyes. "I do." "And do you, Clara Weston, take this man to be your husband?" "I do." "Then I pronounce you man and wife." When Silas kissed her, Grace cheered so loud it nearly shook the rafters. Walking out of that church with Clara on one arm and Grace holding his other hand, Silas felt a deep sense of peace. The pain of his past was still there, but now it had peace alongside it. He had stopped running. He'd found a home, a family, and a future worth everything. That spring, they planted a bigger garden and got some chickens. Silas taught Grace to ride, and she was a natural. Clara grew stronger every day, her spirit now focused on building a life, making their little hollow a place of hope and new beginnings. Something Samuel would have been proud of. That summer, Clara told him she was carrying a child. Silas felt a mix of pure joy and blind terror. The memory of Eleanor was never far, but Clara took his face in her hands. "This isn't Kansas," she told him. "I'm not Eleanor, and you're not the same man you were 4 years ago. We are going to have this baby together, Silas. And whatever comes, we'll face it together." And for the first time in a long, long time, he believed it. He believed good things could happen to him. Their son was born in December, 1 year to the day that Silas had stopped his horse on a snowy trail for a little girl in need. They named him Samuel. Grace fell in love with her baby brother. She took to being a big sister with a fierce kindness, holding him with careful hands and singing to him in a voice that finally sounded like a child's again. Grace told him he was the finest present she had ever received. Silas asked if he was better than riding lessons. She looked right at him, all the shadows gone from her eyes, and said he was better than everything, because now they were a real family, a whole one. Silas looked over at his wife holding their son and his daughter looking proud as punch. He stood there in the cabin that Samuel Weston had put up and that he had helped save. Yeah, he thought. Whole. Years later, folks would ask him about his life. He would tell them it all started the day he was smart enough to stop for a crying child who needed help. He would tell them about a woman too stubborn to die and a life built from nearly nothing. But most of all, he would say that everything changed in that one moment he chose to stop running and become the man he was always meant to be. Some evenings when the world was quiet and the children were sleeping, he would sit with Clara and watch the big sky turn dark. He would think on all the different paths his life could have taken. He could have just ignored that cry for help and kept right on moving. But he stopped. He listened. And because he stayed, he found everything he thought he had lost forever. He found a family, a home, and a heart that knew how to love again. The snowy road he first walked down, following a desperate little girl, had saved him. It gave him a life worth living right here, and every single day he was thankful for it. He learned that home is not a place you find on a map. It is the people who see that you are broken and love you anyway. They are the reason you stop running and start building something that lasts. Silas Brennan had found it all, right here in the snow, and he was never letting it go. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.